was. Could you tell us a little bit about the historical context in Iowa and what the mood of Iowa was when Governor Ray announced that he was going to bring the refugees here?
Sure. So let me explain. Is this a video recorder?
Yes.
Or it is. So I should look at that?
Or you can look at hers.
Oh, you're both two of them here. Okay.
We're trying
All
to
right.
make sure
All
we
right.
don't screw up.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. So the important thing to have in terms of context for what Governor Ray did is there are really three distinct things, three distinct periods, three distinct groups, three distinct actions. The Vietnam War essentially ended on April 30th, 1975. The Americans had withdrawn, and probably 130,000 Vietnamese, mostly Vietnamese, had left. There was also a collapse and takeover in Cambodia and in Laos. So there were a few refugees from Laos, but the great bulk were from Vietnam. Those refugees were taken in a few countries, but the United States took 130,000, and the federal government made the decision that they would be admitted into the United States and that they would be resettled all across the United States. So it was not up to states to decide whether or not they would take refugees. Each state was going to get a proportional number. Part of that was to share the burden, because if left on their own, most refugees would go to a warm place. So they all would have been in Southern California, Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. And the feeling was that the burden should be shared by each state. And so a processing system was set up whereby refugees, once they were out of Vietnam, they were kept in temporary places, but then brought systematically to three centers in the United States, one in California, one in Arkansas, and I think one in Pennsylvania. They were usually old military installations. And from there, refugees would be processed. They'd be given a social security number and card. They would be given some basic orientation about the United States and what it's like to be here. And then their families would be kept intact, and they would be assigned, apportioned to states. The refugees themselves didn't get to choose. They could keep their family, immediate family, intact. And in each state, there would be a group of what are called private or non-governmental organizations, sometimes religious organizations, sometimes the humanitarian organizations, would process the refugees, receive them, help them get settled, find sponsors, find housing, and these organizations would be paid by the federal government to do that. They would receive so much money per refugee and settle them. So there'd be things like Catholic Relief and Lutheran Immigration, HIAS, which is a Hebrew International Assistance.
I saw something from a Baptist organization.
Yes, Church World Service, whole bunch of them. So, and that was all going to happen no matter what. There was a group from Laos called the Thai Dam, and they were their own distinct ethnic people. They had their own language, their own heritage, their own writing script, their own traditions, and had been very much anti-communist, had escaped out of Laos as the government was collapsing, and were in the process and were going to be resettled all across the United States, just like Vietnamese. Now, for the Thai Dam, there were a smaller number, and they had their own culture, and they saw that they were going to be scattered all about. and fearing that this would result in the loss of their culture, their identity, their language, their traditions, they desperately wanted to be resettled in one place. And not knowing exactly how the system all worked, they with the assistance of an American who had worked with them closely in Laos, wrote letters to every governor in America saying, won't you please take all the Thai Dam? So you've heard this story before. And the only governor who responded was Governor Ray, who had a habit of reading all the mail he got from constituents. And he felt now that there was no political benefit to him in the United States. It was strictly out of his compassion as a caring human being that he reacted and thought maybe we can help these people. And so he went to Washington and lobbied the federal government, including at the White House, and said, can't I have all the Thai Dam? And Washington agreed with him. And they were coming here, and then the next step he took was to have the state government of Iowa, and particularly what was then called the Department of Job Service, I think it's now called Workforce Development, but it's the workers' labor organization. And Colleen Shearer was the appointee who headed that organization. And he asked her to take this on because he wanted it to have a jobs orientation, not a social welfare orientation. And he then had the Colleen set up an organization. And even though it was a state government organization, it was set up to be like one of those private voluntary organizations, a non-government organization. So it had a contract with the federal government the same way that Catholic Relief did, or Lutheran Immigration Services, and they received money, and they met and resettled all of the Thai Dam who came to Iowa. Mm-hmm. So that was part one, 1975, and it lasted for 5, 6, 7 years, and there were other Thai Dam who would come at a later time. The second part of Governor Ray's legacy was in regard to the boat people. This came in 1978 and 79. Vietnamese who were escaping out of Vietnam on these rickety boats and going out to sea, and were being turned away if they survived all of the vagaries of being at sea, unprepared, with rickety, frail boats, running out of water, running out of food. The motor stops and you're adrift in the sun, being marauded by pirates. If they survived all that and made it on shore, they were being pushed back out into the ocean by local officials because no government in the world was accepting any more refugees. All right? Okay. And Governor Ray, one night in January of 1979, saw a TV show done by Ed Bradley and was so moved by it that he felt somebody had to do something. So he wrote to President Carter, and in it said, if you will only reopen America's doors, Iowa will double the number of refugees we've already resettled. Okay? Okay. Later that year, the third part of his legacy was when he had gone on a trip to China in October of 79, and following that, with a group of other governors, I was on the trip. We went to Thailand to visit refugee camps. And when we arrived there, we were taken not to the existing camps where there are many refugees waiting, hoping for resettlement, but we were rushed to the Cambodian border at a place called Sakeo, Sakaew, where there were 30,000 Cambodians who had escaped across the border into Thailand, who had lived under the terrorist genocidal Khmer Rouge of Pol Pot for over 4 years. They were starved, emaciated, sick, orphaned, and they were dying at a rate of 50 to 100 per day. We saw the bodies being bulldozed into mass graves. Governor Ray, all the governors, everybody who was there were so incredibly dramatically impacted. So when Governor Ray came back and he brought photos of all this, and they were published in the Des Moines Register, it caused quite a stir. And people said to him, well, what can we do? We have to do something. And religious leaders came to see Governor Ray. And Governor Ray asked me what he thought we should do. And I said, let me think about it. And it occurred to me that we could set up something called Iowa Shares, SHARES, all caps, sends help to aid refugees and end starvation. And we raised money, and we ended up raising over $600,000, which in 1979 money is about like $1.5 million today. We rushed food and medicine that reached the refugees, the starving refugees, on Christmas Day of 1979, a wonderful Christmas present from the people of Iowa. And then we sent doctors and nurses from Iowa to work in the hospital there over the next several years, paying for it with Iowa Shares money. We also sent food and medicine inside Cambodia as well. So there are those three parts of Governor Ray's legacy. But I can see you already know all that, so maybe I've wasted your time telling this. The one other nice story from the trip to Thailand, when we went to Sakeo, after that we went and visited other refugees who had been there several years and went to a Thai Dam camp. And there they had a big sign welcoming Governor Ray by name and brought us into the camp and said, we want to show you our symbol of hope. And the symbol of hope, which they had in this little thatched hut, was an Iowa Department of Transportation road map tacked up on the wall. And the symbol of Iowa was their symbol of hope. And in it were these tacks showing where the Thai Dam who already were here were living, and others would be what they hoped to join. So here, 12,000 miles away, our state, the shape of our state was the symbol of hope to people who had left everything behind, didn't know what was going to happen to them, to their families, to their future, what would happen, what more might happen for them.
Wow. When Governor Ray announced that he was going to be bringing the refugees here, we've read letters of support and we've read letters of non-support.
They're absolutely right, and there were piles of them. And the governor's office would get letters every day about various subjects, and the letters would be sent out to the various staff members to help prepare the first answer. I got all the refugee letters. So I had the biggest piles of letters in the office, and they were honestly about 50-50. They were letters from people saying how proud they were. People said, you know, I've always voted in the other party, but you've made me so proud to be an Iowan. And there were others who said, why are you giving away our jobs? Why are you bringing these people here? They're not like us. And Governor Ray used to particularly like to answer some of those. And he had us count how many jobs were advertised in the Des Moines Register. There was like 1,200 jobs. And he would call people who wrote to them about taking jobs, and he'd say, I want you to know there's 1,200 jobs. Why don't you go and get one of those jobs before any refugee gets here? So he was very straightforward, but there were. And I would say the first group of refugees who came was not controversial. I think there was a great feeling on the part of Americans who, whether they supported the Vietnam War or were opposed to it, that the people who were leaving had been put in a difficult position because they had sided with us and that we had some obligation to them. And it was only right that we would help them and not abandon them completely. It was then where the questions and where the letters came up were when you had the second tranche of refugees, the boat people, and helping them, because now this were additional people. It was 4 years later. Oh, why are you doing more? The war's been over. Why do we have to do that? Iowa Shares was not bringing people here. It was sending food, medicine, and help to them, and that wasn't really controversial.
Okay. You've talked a little bit about how did the governor's task force work? How was that organized and worked to allow the refugees to come here? How did he put that together?
Well, the task force was the people who worked for Colleen Shearer. So they were involved in, they were employees who were hired, and their job was, some of them would be reaching out to churches and communities to find sponsors, to find housing. They would be, others would be involved in trying to help find jobs, find employment opportunities. So they worked in, others were prepared, well, we have more coming, they're arriving, we have to meet them. It helped organize a refugee celebration in the first year after they had been here, which is where I met Governor Ray and how I ended up coming to work for him on loan from the State Department. I wasn't here in 75 or 76 during the initial flow of the tie down. I came in 78 and was here when the boat people and the Iowa Shares part was done.
When you came, what I read today, and me and I were going through a variety of boxes, was that you had worked with the State Department on this issue or not?
Yes.
Okay.
Very long. So I'd worked 10 years.
Okay.
I served in Vietnam for 6 years. Then I was at the White House on the National Security Council staff for 2.5 years, including when the war ended and the evacuation came. And then I worked for 1.5 years at the State Department in the beginning of the Carter administration, and was working on some of the issues of could we bring any more refugees here, and which we had not really gotten anywhere in Washington. So it was interesting that it took leading from Iowa to change the federal government. I had been working with some people who wanted to change the policy and bring more refugees, help the boat people in the State Department, and they couldn't be effective. But coming here and working for a governor from a different party and working on the issue, and we were able to get it changed.
I saw the House bill in one of the files, I believe. Yes. And so that was the bill that was changed that would allow more to come, or did I not look at that correctly?
I don't know about House bills.
Okay, I just...
The decision to bring more refugees was one that we interacted with the federal government, and the federal government was supporting it. And so the governor, was acting on his own authority. He didn't have to have state appropriated money in order to do it. Now, there may have been other appropriations later that supplemented the work at the Department of Job Service or the Refugee Task Force, but there was not any need to get a bill passed to do these things.
So you came to Iowa via Governor Ray.
Yes.
When you look back on that time period, what was the biggest political impact of bringing the refugees here, or was there a political impact?
Well, first, the thing I would say is that Governor Ray never considered the political impact when he made any of these decisions. In the first instance, when the first group came, and they were coming anyway. So it was not any decision he made. But I think his reaching out to the Thai Dam would be seen in a positive way by some people. But there were refugees coming to every state on that. Secondly, there would be, in regard to the boat people, there was no political benefit to be gained by doing that. There was not going to play and get him a lot of votes. It would be only negative things, but he never thought about that. He always was just driven by the humanitarian concern, the compassion he had, by things that had been instilled in him by his family, his religion, his education. He was just this very decent, good person who acted that way. So, but as you saw, as you mentioned, there were a lot of letters that people said for political impact. So there were certainly some negatives to it, and more intense feelings about that than any other issue. At the same time, there were a lot of people who liked what he did, respected him, admired him, wrote about it, and in there were a significant number of people in the Democratic Party who admired him, and then when it came time to vote, crossed over and voted for him.
One of the letters that we saw was from children at a school, and the whole class had signed it, and
Yes.
they had sent a donation, and then there were a variety of other letters, a lot of, I would say from what I read today, faith-based letters, that this was, as you said, the right thing to do.
Yes. Yeah.
Did Governor Ray ever question any of his decisions to bring them here? Did he ever have a moment where?
I do not ever recall any time he ever questioned any of it. I think he was always very, very proud of it. He would make the point that it's the Iowa people who are so good, that it was the Iowa people who received the refugees and who opened their hearts and their homes to them. So he always looked to that, and he saw basic goodness in that. There were a lot of powerful letters. There were, when the first photos were shown of the Iowa shares of the Cambodians who were suffering, their children wrote, and the Des Moines Register ran a whole page of letters from children. Why are these children suffering? And so on. And then as we raised money, we would receive letters from adults and some children, and we had some children write and send in their money, maybe $10, $5, say, this is the money that was going to be for my Christmas presents. And my parents gave it to me, and I'm sending it in for the suffering and dying Cambodians. One woman sent us her wedding rings to sell. She said, I don't have any money, but here are my wedding rings, sell them. So we sent them back. Sent them back to her. So there were stories like that of incredible personal empathy.
One of the things that National History Day tries to do is to bring the story forward and set it in today's context with immigration.
Yes.
And so, do you think, or do we see another Governor Ray in today's world that would step up and?
So I think.
This is the so what question.
Yeah, no. So but this comes up, and it's difficult. The situations are really not comparable.
Okay.
Immigration issues have to do about economic circumstances and whether people are coming to looking for jobs, looking for work. So we're talking about illegal immigration now. Enter the country illegally. And the Indochina refugees were always about humanitarian issues. Although some people would write letters and say they're going to take our jobs, but the motivation was always humanitarian. And some of it was bringing people here when there was no other choice. And some of it was, well, when there is a choice, maybe sending help to them in place is the right thing to do, the good choice. So that's something you'll see now that gets discussed around Syrian and Middle Eastern refugees. Well, can you find a way to help them in place? And in fact, within the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, they have various kinds of solutions. The best one is when you can have people go back to where they used to live. And in Cambodia, we had that. They had millions of people come back from Thailand when there was peace in Cambodia and go back to where they used to live. A second, and those are, it's called a durable solution. A second is that when there's nothing else that can ever happen, they can never go home or anything else, then, and only then, you try to find, well, is there some other place where they can be resettled? And in between, you have this transition period where people are refugees or can be for some considerable amount of time. So Indochina refugees was a unique period of time. It was in the aftermath of a war where we were heavily involved, where there was a sense in the country we had an obligation to people. It was a response when lives were being lost, and the only way to help them, the only way to save lives, was to accept people. And then it was in terrible suffering and dying, but where people could be helped by getting them medicine and food and sustain them in place.
When they brought the boat people here, because that would be what you had experience with, did they try to keep them together as they did the Thai Dam, or was that more?
No, because the boat people were all Vietnamese. Okay. There were Vietnamese all over America. But when you brought them here and they were resettled and they were would fit into certain communities, and then some would pick up and move, some would be, last year. So there are Vietnamese here who have been here for 40 years now. Others who have picked up and moved where they thought there was more opportunity, or they had some family member. So it's not surprising. There are, Vietnamese communities outside Washington, D.C., and in California, and in Louisiana, and other places.
We're going this afternoon to interview Mr. Nguyen, Doc Nguyen.
Mm-hmm.
And when I visited with him on the phone, he said, well, I'm one of the few because it was too cold in Iowa.
Yeah, that's right. It was a little cold. Yeah,
and
sure.
He said a lot of people made the decision to move to warmer areas, is what he said to me on the phone.
Yeah.
So, and I can relate to that after last week. It was pretty cold.
It was indeed.
Okay, Mia, what else should we ask?
What was the most challenging part of helping the refugees, like with housing, money, space, or language barrier?
I think there was a big part about having schools adjust. Now we're sort of used to having a lot of different languages spoken in communities, and schools have learned how to work with that, and they have English as a second language courses. All that was brand new back then. And so schools were scrambling about what do we do? We have these students, they're in class, they can't really work in English, and we have to figure out how to do this. So that was number one, was making school work. A second was that you'd find that young people were more adaptable, they could learn, they could fit, but older people who would come and who had jobs and professions, so couldn't really step in and do that. And so they were now forced, if they were going to work, to be out in much different level of employment, and their status in society wouldn't be as high, and so they had to struggle. So that was difficult. So, and then sometimes you would have refugees who could become isolated, and if they were resettled in only a few of them in a small town or so, and there weren't any others around, that could lead to some,
Well, there was a
difficulty and occasionally some tragic thing. Somebody might take their life, or
Well, there was a Des Moines Register article today about a young man who was supposed to go to school at Adele, and the school refused him entrance into the school. And I just was like, oh,
Yeah.
I just can't even imagine a school doing that.
Yeah,
But
so that didn't happen back then. Communities worked hard. But then as this started costing cities and school districts money, then it was, well, where do we go to get this? So the federal government was, I think, pretty generous back then in providing grants and understanding the issues and finding out where the problems are. So there would be meetings of people who are working with refugees, sharing experiences. And the other thing is that this was a much more heterogeneous state. So it was mostly Europeans who were here. There were very, very few people who look like you, or who came from Asia or from other cultures. And so it was startling there. It was unusual, but the state adjusted to it, adapted to it, and like in previous, when I was growing up, there was a distinction between Germans and Irish and Polish and Italians, and you don't think of that now.
well,
at all. So-
my parish, the church is St. Patrick's, which is Irish.
And St. Mary's is 2 blocks away.
But the school was St. Joseph and was the German
The
side.
German school.
Yes, so, it's...
In Cascade, Iowa, near where I lived, 3,000 people. There were 2 Catholic churches, St. Martin's and St. Mary's. Martin's was the Irish, Mary's the Germans. They had their own church, their own grade school, their own high school.
And that's the way it was.
Germans and Irish didn't mix.
Yeah, they didn't like each other very much sometimes. Okay, honey, what else do you have there?
For National History Day, they usually start off with a theme for students to choose a topic that fits the theme. And this year the theme is taking a stand. And so how does Governor Ray's actions fit the theme of taking a stand?
So here it is. Here's the story. The boat people, 100,000 or more, escaping, being turned away. The first governing leader anywhere in the world to offer to accept and save the boat people was the governor of Iowa. He took the stand before any other governing leader at any level of government, president, king, prime minister, whatever. The governor of Iowa. There you go.
I think that's your answer. Okay, what else do you have, honey?
What, do you have
Yeah,
any from yours?
yeah.
No, not
Yeah.
really, because I think he's...
So the end of the report saying he made the shape of the state of Iowa a symbol of hope for forlorn people 12,000 miles away.
I think we can use that.
Yep.
Do you have any suggestions other than Wayne Johnson of people that we might try to contact? Obviously,
There's a woman named Kim Poem, P-O-A-M. I'm not sure what she's doing. She's been involved with organizations.
okay.
She and her family were the center of an hour-long documentary that Iowa Public Television did. Have you watched that?
We've watched pieces of it, but with Governor Ray on the IPTV site that says
Yeah.
Governor Ray the humanitarian.
Yeah,
So I'm calling
yeah.
IPTV anyway, so.
yeah. There was a man Vietnamese, who's also highlighted in that same video,
Okay.
who worked for Congressman Boswell. So he knew a lot. I'm sorry, I don't remember his
That's
name.
okay.
But he's featured in there because I think he was settled over in Cedar Rapids.
Well, there's a gentleman by the name of,
There's a man named Doe, D-O, who's here in town, who's a businessman who's been pretty successful.
and he's just D.O.
That's his last name. I don't know.
That's okay, we'll
Yeah.
do some looking. Vin Nguyen, who works for Des Moines Public Schools, we've tried to get a hold of him and had not any success yet.
Win Van Vin. Vin
Yes.
is his name.
Yes.
Vin. Yeah, he's like a curriculum guy or
Yeah, well,
something.
I keep trying.
He'd be worth talking to.
Okay.
You might ask over at the